of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into ruins, the men who had once commanded Hitler's armies found themselves scattered across a broken continent with no front line left to hold, no victory left to promise, and no Führer left to obey, because Hitler had escaped the war he started by killing himself in a bunker beneath Berlin, while the generals, field marshals, admirals, and staff officers who had carried his orders across Europe were still alive when the Allies came for them. Some surrendered in full uniform, still wearing the decorations of a dead regime. Some tried to present themselves as professional soldiers who had only served their country. Some blamed Hitler, the SS, the Nazi Party, the chaos of war, or the orders they claimed they had no power to resist. But the war was over. The concentration camps had been opened, the occupied cities had been liberated, the mass graves had been uncovered, and the question facing Hitler's surviving commanders was no longer whether Germany could still win. It was whether the men who helped wage the most destructive war in human history were soldiers, criminals, or both. The collapse happened faster than many of them could emotionally accept. In the final weeks of the war, German armies were surrendering in the West, being shattered in the East, and falling apart inside Germany itself. Soviet troops fought through Berlin. American and British forces crossed the Elbe. Millions of German soldiers were trying to surrender to the Western Allies because they feared Soviet captivity far more than British or American prison camps. Hitler's orders became increasingly detached from reality, demanding counterattacks from armies that no longer existed, commanding cities to fight to the last street, and expecting obedience from a military structure that was already disintegrating. For years, the generals had served a system that rewarded obedience and punished doubt. But in the spring of 1945, obedience no longer produced strategy. It produced ruins. When Hitler died on April 30th, 1945, he did not name one of his famous field marshals as his successor. He named Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the German Navy and the man most closely associated with the U-boat war in the Atlantic. For a few strange weeks after Hitler's suicide, Donitz led what was left of the German state from Flensburg, near the Danish border, trying to keep a government alive after the country it claimed to govern had already been destroyed. His goal was not victory. That had become impossible. His goal was to surrender German forces to the Western Allies while allowing as many soldiers and civilians as possible to flee westward away from the Red Army. It was the final calculation of a defeated regime. Not how to win the war, but how to choose the enemy to whom one would surrender. The surrender documents ended the war in Europe, but they did not end the reckoning. On May 7th, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of German forces at Reims, and the next day, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel appeared in Berlin to ratify the surrender before the Soviets and the Western Allies. The scene was humiliating in a way that none of Hitler's commanders could escape. Men who had once signed orders sending armies across borders now signed papers admitting that the war was lost completely. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. The generals who had helped conquer Poland, France, the Balkans, the Soviet borderlands, and much of Europe now stood before their enemies as representatives of defeat. The Allies arrested the Flensburg government on May 23, 1945, ending the last ghost of Hitler's state. Donitz was taken into custody. Jodl was taken. Keitel was taken. Other commanders were captured in prison camps, country houses, hospitals, and temporary headquarters across Germany and Austria. Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the old Prussian field marshals who had commanded in Poland, France, Russia, and the West, became a British prisoner. Albert Kesselring, who had commanded German forces in Italy and later in the West, surrendered after the collapse of southern Germany. Erich von Manstein, often called one of Germany's most talented operational commanders, was arrested by the British. The surviving military elite of Nazi Germany had entered a new kind of battlefield, where maps, tanks, and divisions no longer mattered, and where the documents they had signed during the war became more dangerous than any enemy gun. Nuremberg was designed to answer a question that had never been answered on this scale before. The Allies were not simply trying defeated officers for losing a war. They were trying to prove that planning aggressive war, carrying out criminal orders, murdering civilians, killing prisoners, and organizing conquest were crimes even when they had been done by governments and armies. This was a direct challenge to the defense many German commanders wanted to use. They wanted to say they had been soldiers. They wanted to say politics belonged to Hitler and the Nazi Party. They wanted to say atrocities belonged to the SS. They wanted to separate the German army from the crimes of the regime it had served. But the paper trail from the war told a darker story. Wilhelm Keitel became one of the clearest examples of what obedience to Hitler had produced. He had served as the head of the armed forces high command, close to Hitler, present at the center of military decision-making, and willing to sign orders that turned the war in the East into a war of annihilation. Keitel had not been the brilliant battlefield commander of legend. He was remembered by many German officers as loyal, submissive, and willing to attach his name to Hitler's will. At Nuremberg, that loyalty became evidence against him, because the orders signed by Keitel were connected to the execution of commandos, the mistreatment and murder of prisoners, and the brutal methods used in occupied territory. His defense was built around duty and obedience, but the court did not accept that a man could escape responsibility simply because the crimes he helped authorize came from above. Alfred Jodl faced a similar judgment. As chief of the operations staff of the German High Command, he had been deeply involved in the planning and direction of military operations. His name appeared on orders tied to illegal warfare, including the treatment of commandos and Soviet political officers. Jodl tried to present himself as a staff officer executing military duties in a chain of command dominated by Hitler, but the prosecutors argued that he had helped wage wars of aggression and had participated in a system where criminal orders were not accidents but policy. He was not accused because he had been defeated. He was accused because the war he helped run had been criminal from its beginning. On October 1st, 1946, the Nuremberg verdicts were delivered, and the old military hierarchy of the Reich was forced to hear judgment from the nations it had tried to conquer. Keitel was found guilty and sentenced to death. Jodl was found guilty and sentenced to death. Both men asked, in different ways, for the kind of military death they believed matched their rank, but they were not treated as honorable soldiers dying before a firing squad. They were hanged as war criminals on October 16, 1946. Keitel went to the gallows after declaring that he followed the call of duty, and Jodl gave final words to Germany. But the rope ended the lives of two men who had spent years inside the machinery of Hitler's war. Their deaths sent a message that would echo far beyond Nuremberg. Rank, uniform, and obedience were not shields against criminal responsibility. Donitz's fate was different, and that difference showed how complicated post-war justice would become. He had briefly succeeded Hitler, directed the final surrender, and had commanded the U-boat campaign that brought terror to the Atlantic. At Nuremberg, he was charged with crimes against peace and war crimes, but he was not sentenced to death. He received 10 years in prison. His case became controversial because submarine warfare had been brutal on both sides, and some aspects of the charges against him touched a kind of naval war the Allies had also practiced in the Pacific. Donitz served his sentence at Spandau prison and was released in 1956. Afterward, he lived quietly in West Germany and wrote memoirs defending his record, insisting that he had been a naval officer rather than a criminal architect of Nazi rule. He lived until 1980, long enough to watch Germany rebuild, and long enough to keep arguing for his own version of the past. Other commanders avoided the gallows, but not the shadow of the war. Albert Kesselring was tried by a British military court in Venice in 1947 for crimes connected to German actions in Italy, including reprisals against civilians and the massacre at the Ardeatine Caves, where 335 Italian civilians and prisoners were killed after a partisan attack in Rome. Kesselring had been admired by some soldiers for his energy, charm, and skill in delaying the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula, but the post-war court was not judging his defensive tactics. It was judging the way occupation and retaliation had been carried out under his command. He was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and in 1952 he was released because of ill health. Like several other German commanders, he emerged from prison into a world where former enemies were already beginning to see old German officers through the lens of the Cold War. Erich von Manstein became one of the most important figures in the post-war battle over memory. He had been one of Germany's most gifted operational commanders, associated with the plan that helped defeat France in 1940, and with major campaigns on the Eastern Front. He was not tried at Nuremberg with the major Nazi leaders, but in 1949 he was tried by a British military court in Hamburg and convicted on charges connected to the conduct of war in the Soviet Union, including failure to protect civilians and prisoners in areas under his command. He was sentenced to prison, though the sentence was later reduced, and he was released in 1953. After that, he became an informal advisor during the creation of West Germany's new armed forces and published memoirs that helped shape the image of the German army as strategically brilliant, politically separate from Hitler, and less implicated in Nazi crimes than it really was. Gerd von Rundstedt represented another category, the old field marshal too ill, too old, and too symbolically useful to become the center of a public reckoning. He had commanded major operations from Poland to France to the invasion of the Soviet Union, and he had held high command in the West during the Normandy campaign. After his capture, he was investigated and accused in connection with crimes on the Eastern Front, especially because of his command responsibility during the invasion of the Soviet Union and his relationship to criminal orders and occupation policies. But his failing health and advanced age made a full trial difficult. He was released in 1948 and died in 1953. Rundstedt did not face the same final judgment as Keitel or Jodl, and his fate showed that justice after the war was never evenly applied. Some men were executed, some were imprisoned, some were released because their bodies failed before the courts could fully reach them. This unevenness became one of the defining features of what happened to Hitler's generals after the war. The Allied system had to decide who was a major criminal, who was a military professional caught inside a criminal regime, who could be prosecuted with available evidence, who was too old or too ill, and who might become useful in the new struggle already forming between the West and the Soviet Union. In 1945, the German officer corps stood in the shadow of defeat and atrocity. By the early 1950s, the political weather had changed. The Soviet Union, which had been an Allied partner against Hitler, became the main threat in Western strategic thinking. Germany, once the defeated enemy, became a future frontline state in the Cold War. The knowledge of German officers who had fought the Red Army suddenly had value. That new reality did not erase their crimes, but it changed how urgently some Western governments wanted to keep punishing them. Former German commanders were interviewed, studied, and consulted. Their experience on the Eastern Front was mined for lessons about Soviet tactics and logistics. West Germany needed a new military, and the Western Alliance needed German manpower and expertise. Men who had recently served Hitler were now able to present themselves as experts against Stalin. The moral clarity of 1945 began to collide with the strategic needs of the Cold War, and in that collision, many reputations softened faster than they should have. The generals understood this opening and used it. They wrote memoirs, gave interviews, advised governments, joined veterans organizations, and repeated a version of history that became powerful in post-war Europe and America. In this version, the German army had fought honorably. The generals had been professionals, Hitler had interfered with their genius, and the real crimes had belonged to the SS, the Gestapo, and the Nazi Party. This story became known as the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, and it was one of the most successful acts of historical self-defense ever carried out by a defeated military class. It allowed men who had commanded armies in a war of extermination to speak as if they had been trapped witnesses rather than active participants. The truth was far darker. The German army was deeply involved in the war of annihilation in the East. It cooperated with SS killing operations, enforced brutal occupation policies, starved prisoners, participated in reprisals, and helped create the conditions in which mass murder could take place. Not every soldier committed atrocities, and not every general had the same level of guilt. But the idea that the Wehrmacht stood cleanly apart from Nazi crimes was false. Many generals knew enough, signed enough, tolerated enough, or benefited enough from criminal policies that their claims of innocence could not survive serious examination. Yet by writing early and loudly, many of them shaped public memory before historians fully dismantled their version of events. This is why the fate of Hitler's generals cannot be measured only by prison sentences and execution dates. Keitel and Jodl died on the gallows. Donitz served 10 years and defended himself for the rest of his life. Kesselring was sentenced to death, spared, imprisoned, released, and later honored by veterans who preferred to remember his military skill rather than the crimes tied to his command. Manstein went from prisoner to advisor and author, helping shape the military memory of the Eastern Front. Rundstedt escaped a full trial and died as an old soldier rather than a condemned criminal. Their outcomes were different, but together they show the strange afterlife of Hitler's military elite: defeat, judgment, partial punishment, rehabilitation, and then a long struggle over memory. For the families of victims, for the occupied countries, and for survivors of German occupation, this uneven justice could feel like betrayal. How could men who commanded armies in a criminal war return to comfortable homes, write memoirs, receive visitors, and speak as authorities on strategy? How could commanders whose orders had helped devastate Europe present themselves as soldiers above politics? The answer lies in the chaos of evidence, the limits of post-war courts, the priorities of governments, the illness and age of defendants, and the brutal speed with which the Cold War changed the moral landscape. Justice happened at Nuremberg, but it did not reach everyone equally, and it did not stop the defeated from trying to control how their defeat would be remembered. The irony is that Hitler's generals lost the war, but did not all lose the story. On the battlefield, their armies were destroyed. Their cities were occupied. Their state disappeared. Their Führer killed himself underground rather than face trial. But after the war, some of the surviving commanders fought a quieter campaign with memoirs, testimonies, selective memory, and Cold War usefulness. They blamed Hitler for bad decisions, blamed the SS for atrocities, blamed politics for defeat, and claimed military professionalism for themselves. For decades, That version influenced how many people understood the German army in World War II, especially in the West. What really happened to Hitler's generals after World War II was not one fate, but many. Some were hanged as criminals. Some were imprisoned and later released. Some were sentenced to death and spared. Some escaped trial because they were too old or too sick. Some became advisors. Some became authors. Some spent the rest of their lives insisting that they had served Germany, not Hitler, even though the war they fought had carried Hitler's ambitions across Europe. Their medals survived the defeat. Their ranks appeared in memoirs. Their names remained in military histories. But behind the uniforms and the claims of duty was a harder truth. The men who helped command Hitler's armies could not fully separate themselves from the war Hitler made them fight. By the time the last of them died, Germany had become a different country. The Cold War had reshaped Europe, and historians were still fighting through the myths these men had left behind. The gallows at Nuremberg punished some of the highest officers, but prison cells, memoirs, releases, and quiet retirements showed the limits of justice after a war so vast that no court could reach every guilty man. Hitler's generals survived him in different ways, but none escaped the shadow of the ruins they helped create, because after Germany fell, the final battle of the German High Command was no longer fought with armies. It was fought over guilt, memory, and the question of whether obedience in a criminal war could ever be called honor. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.